I was so taken with the many stories that populate your book and all these women who are simultaneously like, I guess, iconic, right? Or they feel like they represent a tendency, or they're symptomatic of a series of political and material kind of contradictions or affinities. But also they're always people who have, as they say, they've got agency, right? And so there's this. I found myself continually encountering in all the different characters, and even the characters that I already kind of knew, like Mary Wollstonecraft, etc. This feeling of like, I can only really express it in a sound like, oh, right? Like
Mm.
when you find out, or when this moment where a person really does seem quote unquote of their time, but also clearly has real remarkable courage and valor in other ways, but then it is just like, I'm going to be symptomatic, or like, this is the thing. I don't know. I'm not even really. I'm articulating a feeling of grim resignation vis-a-vis some of the people that you write about here.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that was probably why I came to write that little reflection on the saying that is it to understand all is to forgive all? I can't, there's some version of that, right?
Yeah.
Because I think getting intimate with some of these women in the archival sense is to become perhaps something akin to fond of them, even if they are the worst people on earth. I mean, that's one of the difficult aspects that is actually methodologically and ethically quite debated and controversial on the left, right? Including in the present sort of research sense of where comrades go undercover as journalists with Proud Boys or neo-Nazis or, white nationalists. I mean, I think I've been privy to these sorts of controversies ever since I was, on the left. I remember kind of fighting it out about whether it had been useful for, one notorious feminist to sort of pal around with Milo Yiannopoulos and in order to understand more, and in order to get under the bonnet of these ideologies. and I sort of don't think it is particularly okay or useful necessarily simply to make them more intelligible. I think I actually fall on that side of this debate. Like, I don't know. I mean, maybe I can't square this with what I've just done in Enemy Feminism, so perhaps we can discuss how that works out, how it shakes out based on what I'm also trying to say next, right, about it, right? But I think there is a tendency to do exposés, features on fascists that don't sufficiently wrestle with the fact that they become a little bit understandable, as they must. They're humans, and therefore perhaps less easy to combat as enemies. And surely that's not the intention of people going undercover to do this stuff. I mean, sure, there's information gathering and and that can be tactically useful. But I do think we tend to really struggle with conversations about how, to fight people we consider, well, I suppose what I'm saying in this book is like kin. Now, obviously, I don't consider fascists kin, but
no, but there's a degree of like, to the extent that someone considers themselves feminist, there's the tendency to see them as fellow travelers.
Yeah.
And I know one of the ones that Patrick and I were both really like, in this our like daily long walk, we had a couple of long walks where we got to talk about enemy feminisms. And one of the figures that was so interesting to both of us, I think for different reasons, was the feminist police officer.
Yes.
And I we'll get into the sort of the historical examples of that you deal with so well presently, but I also found myself thinking it, because this also checks some of the other boxes, or like the examples of like different types of complicity, engagement, or like, let's call it embeddedness in these institutions. It made me think of, well, of all people, Rosa Brooks, who is...
That's Barbara Ehrenreich's daughter, right?
Yeah, and who is named, as she writes in her fairly recent, I think, 2021 memoir, is named after Rosa Luxemburg and Rosa Parks. Like, it's a twofer, yeah. And, she's a a writer and has written about the military industrial complex, etc. But the reason that I was thinking
But
about,
she like embeds as a cop.
well, she becomes a cop. She actually becomes a DC police officer,
Yeah.
and not just in a participant observer kind of way. Like, she does the training and she fulfills her hours and arrests all sort of people. And I think I'm thinking about it both for the substantive, like, real through lines in terms of like these institutions and sort of like these accommodations or like ways in which people like wind themselves or choose to be part of them, but also in the way in which, like, well, cards on the table. It's if people want to read it, it's called Tangled Up in Blue. I have a review of it, I think, in the New Republican about 3-4 years ago now. But among other things, what the book does, and I guess it's a good book as police memoirs go, it's not a very good genre, but is she kind of cries out for psychoanalytic and materialist reading at the same time. And it's kind of, in a weird way, all about her childhood relationship to her mother.
The prominent leftist.
Right, who would do immersion journalism, right? Gave us nickel and
Yeah.
dime. But it's God, I don't want to, like,
You were really tied up in knots about this book, I will say.
Yeah.
I remember when you were reading this. You kept handing it to me to read bits and pieces.
Yeah, and I know you, and in fact, I probably why I'm saying this to you, Sophie, because I know you do also do reviews and criticism, and there is this way in which, like, sometimes when like someone like lays it out there and just puts it out there so baldly, you're like, I can't. People are going to think I'm going for the jugular here, but this just is what it is.
Yeah.
And it's not just like it's a reportage or an ethnography. She's actually materially involved in these processes. But like, just to say this up front, like, there's some really weird shit happening in the Ehrenreich household, and her relationship to like maternal authority and transgression is weird. Whether it be like her stealing weed from her mother as she's growing up, to this like very strange, again, like it's in the book, but like, when she has her first period, her mother congratulates her and says she's really proud of her, and then doesn't do anything else. And so only until she gets to, like, until the point where she leaves to college, she's stealing sanitary products from her mother's like,
gosh,
like bathroom drawer or whatever. Anyway, she decides to become a DC police officer, right?
Oh my goodness.
And to write about it. And again, it's I would say is the best police memoir you can get. She says some things that are like, I think, need to be said and are revelatory coming from police officers, right? That like you very rarely hear them say, including like, maybe we shouldn't feel entitled to come back alive from every encounter if that means that civilians get killed, right? It's like,
wow.
Like, so she actually says that, which is kind of remarkable, right? But she also just goes around arresting people and writing about her feelings with it. And it's probably not a surprise that a lot of the calls that she writes about, or that seem to bother her the most, are her intervening in mother-daughter domestic disputes, or like scenes of women in extremis. And I this one scene, Abby, do you want to read this? I just want to process
I'll read this short passage. Yeah. It fell to me as the only female officer present to cuff Imani and pat her down. She didn't complain or struggle. In her short life, I suppose, she'd already gotten used to things turning out badly. But it was one of my worst moments as a police officer. This girl was a victim, not a criminal. I thought of my own children and imagined how my daughter would feel if both I and her grandmother seemed to be rejecting her. Would she want to lash out at me or hit me? If she did, I wouldn't blame her. Adults are supposed to take care of children. Instead, I was attaching heavy metal handcuffs to Imani's thin wrists. I felt a little sick.
And just to stick the context in here, this is one of several calls where she shows up and like the theme is, we need policy. She clearly, I think, would have been very happy with a job in the Biden administration and wound up doing like a policing think tank at her university. But it was like, our hands are tied. We're forced to make decisions based upon like, quote unquote, bad policy. Right. And so in this case, like, I think like this young woman, Imani, gets into a physical altercation with like her mother's live-in boyfriend or something. But in any event, she is technically, because of the fact that it doesn't own the property or struck first or whatever, she has to go to jail. And so there are lots of scenes where like Rosa Brooks is like arresting homeless people and stuff because they're on this property. She has no choice, and she'll like slide $20 into their into their pocket for when they get out. And so in addition to that, like kind of like arresting while crying thing that's going on, and this weird like substitute mother thing that's happening, it's also it's just out there. Like, it's so fucked up and at once like symptomatic and feels necessary, but it's also somebody's choice to do all these things, but then to write about how my hands are so terribly tied.
As I handcuff someone else.
Yes, I'm literally cuffing a human being.
And I mean, I think all of which is to say that your book makes this kind of phenomenon really legible.
It's sort of like made legible through historical precedent, but also with a kind of like toolkit to understand how people like this could exist, and not just because they are, Barbara Ehrenreich. They're dealing with the family like baggage of, as she says, like a household where getting arrested is good against the man, and war is bad, but aggression is good. Like it made it something other than singular, and it made it feel built in to a certain structure.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That would fuck me up too.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so delighted to welcome Sophie Lewis to Ordinary Unhappiness. Sophie is a self-described recovering academic and writer based in Philadelphia who teaches courses online for the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and publishes cultural criticism everywhere from the LRB to N+1. Sophie is the author of Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family, Abolish the Family, and the forthcoming The Liberation of Children, currently underway and expected from Penguin in 2027, as well as an essay collection also forthcoming called Femphilia. But the book we are here to discuss today, and which is, as we record, coming out tomorrow, but as you are listening, it will have been out for, 6 days, 7 days, something like that, is Enemy Feminisms, TERFs, Policewomen, and Girlbosses Against Liberation, out from Haymarket. Sophie, so delighted to have you back on the show. Listeners will probably remember you from the family abolition episode, and we are so psyched to dig into Enemy Feminisms with you today. Thanks for being here.
I'm delighted to be here. Hi to both of you. Thank you for having me.
So let's get into it. A lot of our listeners will know you from your previous work. I think especially from Abolish the Family. And I'm hoping that before we, really get head on into Enemy Feminisms, you can talk a little bit about how this fits into your trajectory as a writer and thinker. Specifically, how this project, Enemy Feminisms, is conceived in relation to your first two books, both your most recent on family abolition and your first book, Full Surrogacy Now, on what you have termed gestational labor.
Thank you. And excellent job on the tongue twister I've produced for everybody to pronounce. Just on that, I want to brag that Ruth Wilson Gilmore's partner, Craig, came up with the is it Chapel Rowan equivalent? So we're doing any phenomenon. Anyway.
Nice.
Amazing.
So yes, Full Surrogacy Now was about what I call gestational labor. I mean, I didn't coin that. Its subtitle was Feminism Against Family, which is why I have always insisted that it was part of the same thought, in a sense, as the second book, Abolish the Family, which I still self-deprecatingly struggle to call a book. It was commissioned as a pamphlet. And it's very short on purpose.
It's very assignable.
Thank you. Yes. It could be understood, I suppose, almost as a prequel or a clarification of the jumping off point of the intervention I wanted to make on pregnancy. And probably that's why I also felt that so-called, difficult second album syndrome was afflicting me as I was conceptualizing Enemy Feminisms, rather than, I don't know, difficult third album, which is not a phrase. Because for me, the first two were part of the same project. And Full Surrogacy Now did have some material on prohibitionist anti-contract pregnancy feminism in it, the sort of wrong abolitionism, as I was calling it over the years. Gosh, this goes back to 2014. I've been thinking about these things for a long time. And that sort of stop surrogacy now feminism is the sort of Charybdis to the Scylla of neoliberal reprotect boosterism of the sort of Oprah Winfrey, I love this, surrogacy as women helping women kind of approach. But Full Surrogacy Now was not so much about surrogacy as we know it, or what we think of per se when we say surrogacy, so much as I hope it was fundamentally teasing out something impossible, some kind of impossibility in the term and concept surrogacy, which is, it's only something that exists inside of a regime of private property, showing how that impossibility is dialectically a way into the already latent reality in which we all already are mother one another, perhaps. We all perhaps mother one another already latently, but this important political necessity has to do with coming up with social forms, institutions that are adequate to that fact. So the way I put this is we are the makers of one another. The point is to learn to act like it. And so there was an injunction towards something I call amniotechnics, which is a sort of distributed, skillful, gestational practice of holding and letting go. And so it was a book for and about comrades, and this is a very cringingly sort of earnest term that is not to everyone's taste, I know, but sort of mom raids, right? Mom. And this, I've noticed that there is a shift, I suppose, if we're calling those two sort of one intervention together. There's an imperative in the title, abolish this and full surrogacy now, whereas this one has a different title type, right? It's more of a bestiary, I suppose one might say, although it is also at the same time, and yeah, this is maybe controversial or counterintuitive, but I think it is a love letter to feminism. I think it is, Enemy Feminisms is a love letter to feminism. It is part of the utopian gesture to negate, right? That's process, isn't it? Utopian process is negating in order to build alternative worlds, insist on alternative realities, to denaturalize the given. And so, I hope that they also feel connected to some extent, and that it's not depressing to read Enemy Feminisms per se, or not exclusively so.
I love what you just said about sort of like defamiliarizing the given, in that I was trying to think about from 10,000 feet up, observing like the menagerie as it unfolds and does its thing across space and time. A bestiary, yeah, sorry.
Oh my goodness, guys. I remember suddenly that I used the word agnotological or agnotology in the book proposal, which is probably one of the reasons why it never got bought by a particularly big commercial press, because bestiary is one rather unsympathetic way of putting it. Agnotology, the study of ignorance, right, was another way I was putting it. I think an editor at a big publishing house was like, what?
That's gonna be a bestseller about like the internet disinformation and stuff within a year or two. I suspect that'll be like But I guess and that this underscores the point actually, because
we'll all know that word in here.
Insofar as that, like from 10,000 feet up, I kept on like thinking about how one thing that the examples drove home for me in a way that felt sort of genuinely similar to a lot of what I think we kind of prize in psychoanalytic thinking, which was the way in which like the given is not given, or like it's given, but it doesn't have to be this particular way. And yes, it's depressing to kind of have that lesson driven home on the level of our specific sort of expectations, naive as they may be, that like solidarity would be given, right? That like all these people, no one's going to be problematic, and like everyone's going to be universalist and like it's just the right way. and then realizing, oh, actually, no, they're going to be anti-solidaristic in these sort of legible ways, and that's terrible. But if we define these, then maybe we could imagine things being otherwise, and that much like, I guess, like sanity or anything else of value, solidarity has to be like made and constituted in an ongoing way. It's an achievement and it takes work. And that, I don't know, that was, I just wanted to speak to the question of givenness and also to the idea that this was just depressing. Like it actually, I think in some ways was like,
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I didn't find it depressing. I found it, and I'm have to say I'm putting my gender studies professor hat on. Not that I ever really take that hat off, but you know, it gave me a lot to think about in terms of like really like nitty gritty stuff. Like, what do I assign now that I or what would I not assign now that I have you know what I mean? All of these sort of questions of like exposure, right? And we have that sense sometimes, and especially in this current administration, that like the idea of like someone being exposed to something is in itself this kind of like danger, right? And I think your book like allows us to explore that in a lot of ways, while also not letting many forms of feminism off the hook. And so let me ask you a question that I think is really important for our listeners that we get out at the very beginning, right? There's two terms that structure this text. We're definitely going to talk about the meaning of the enemy or enemies a little later on. But, you know, as Patrick and I were talking, we found that we both had the same kind of first question. We want to get into this objection that your book anticipates and parries at length very early on. You're like, I want to make this really, really clear. And I think it's important that you do. And this is the, oh, but that's not real feminism claim, right? So the dismissal of a certain strain of activism or thought that understood or understands itself from within as feminism, by arguing that feminism is incompatible with, say, being pro-life, or that feminism is incompatible with fascism, or that feminism is incompatible with imperialism. And so this dismissal runs something like, even if these movements and thinkers called themselves feminists, they actually weren't, because true feminism, the heart of feminism, the real meaning of real feminism, is that it is a fundamentally emancipatory, liberatory project, right? And so instead of engaging in this dismissal, instead of letting people just do the, oh, that's not real feminism, so we can move on, your account in Enemy Feminisms demands that your readers think both critically and comparatively about their investments in the term feminism and the legitimacy of different figures and movements to claim it. And the detailed case studies that stud the book make clear that many problematic tendencies have been and continue to be deeply compatible with more welcome, so to speak, feminisms, and that we need to understand them on their own terms as feminist projects. So can you talk a little bit about both this impulse to dismiss and to disqualify and why you reject it as a starting point for the book?
Great. Absolutely. I suppose I say this, but it's working it out for myself as much as anything else. Or that was certainly an impulse at one point. I was not clear on this. I didn't know in advance that I would definitely find that this was where I fell down on it. But you know, I mean, I sort of tell the story a little bit, you know, when you cut your teeth as a feminist in the West, I suppose I mean, certainly I am probably never, well, who knows, never say never, but I'm a feminist through and through or something, you know, I feel like it was my first fight when I was 4 years old or something. And, you know, I'm with it. I suppose the impulse to say, well, that can't be real feminism, whenever I encountered it in my teens or early 20s, as in I was looking at things that were blatantly xenophobic or Islamophobic or whorephobic. And I would prefer to say that, you know, that they're not real feminists. They're not doing real feminism. That, you know, my friends do this still. It's a valid thing to do, and I even say that in the book, don't I? Like it there's plenty to be said for this strategy. When you say this, you're letting certain groups of people know you stand with them, not, you know, with the women persecuting them, essentially, right?
I've certainly said this many times.
Absolutely.
Lean in feminism, that's not real feminism. That
Right.
kind of, you know, yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm about to have a series of I'm really looking forward to them, conversations with the philosopher Serene Kader, who has a book called Faux Feminism out
cool.
now. And as you can tell from the title, it's a different approach, which I certainly don't want to disrespect at all. Like, you know, the title says it, doesn't it? Faux feminism, as in, you know, it's not the real thing. Now, do we really disagree? We'll see. We'll figure it out, right? I suspect there is a little bit of. I mean, clearly, there's a tactical. There's something here, right? I'm saying, no, Israel feminism is enemy. You know, don't know why I devolved into some kind of non-grammatical format there, but you know. So, what was your question? Why is this important? In feminist movement, as I've lived it, I've felt that we are, you know, and perhaps at certain historic moments, this is less important. You know, we're avoiding confronting things that we need to because of our sorrow and confusion at the fact that people we understand to be, at least intentionally, on our side. We're pulling our punches, and I'm not sure we can afford to do so in a conjuncture where fascism is winning so very hard as it is now. There are possibly other reasons why we might want to, you know, strengthen our ability to act by calling enemy feminisms, you know, feminisms and enemies. But that's kind of one of them. I think of this book as a bit of an anti-fascist strategy intervention in a sense. I wanted to.
That's
sort of,
very clear. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I wanted to sit down, do a lot of reading in archives and in history books over more or less 200 years of Western feminism and sort of try and decide for myself, quite honestly, you know, do I think that it works to say that the feminists in the KKK, in the British Union of Fascists, and so on and so forth, were just not feminists? Does that work in a historic sense? You know, does it make sense to say so? And I just had to conclude, no, you know, it doesn't work. We can't really do that. I mean, I suppose we're always doing that when we say, you know, feminism doesn't mean that for me. It, you know, sure, but I think the way we tend to use words, you know, I mean, that what is really interesting, right, is the conversation that we have in the West in liberal culture around figures like Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, or Wollstonecraft, you know, because those conversations tend to be very, very intent nowadays on keeping them, you know, good, right?
Form others, right?
Yes. So, you know, you can have quite swinging op-eds, you know, in the New York Times about white women throwing black women under the bus in the suffrage movement. And you can have, you know, all sorts of pieces circulating in the atmosphere about really quite shockingly white supremacist moments in feminism. And somehow the result is, okay, you know, we've apologized, we've recognized things, and there's a sort of, well, you know, we can carry on. We've said sorry, haven't we? Okay, we've reflected on it. Okay, and now, you know, we just acknowledge times have changed, we've grown, but there's a sort of fundamental we that stays the same. Like there's something very reparative about that conversation. By the way, this is not a critique of the excellent books, you know, that came out about white feminism. There were many of them in 2021. Kyla Schuller's, Rafia Zakaria's, there's one in the UK from Alison Phipps, which is excellent. You know, many, Ruby Hamad, Mickey Kendall, Jessie Daniels. You know, there really seemed to be a moment where white feminism was coming in for a beating. And the authors are, you know, really interested in cultivating the best of us, the non-defensiveness in us. But I think, and again, not their fault, but the conversation sometimes became like, okay, well, women who happen to be white, because this is how people sometimes want to understand whiteness as something you can't possibly do anything about. If you can't betray it, you can't change it. You just sort of acknowledge it and guiltily atone for it, perhaps. The conversation became, well, white feminists in the past, quote unquote, left people out and left people behind. But we just sort of do inclusion, we do intersectionality, and then we're good.
We've solved the problem.
Yeah. And, there are limits to metaphors here, right? But if you're going to sort of widen a tent that fundamentally sucks, okay, what does that do? I mean, don't widen that tent, let it blow away, burn it down. I don't know. This is what a student asked me in a lecture. Like, if we don't widen the tent, what do you do with the tent? I don't know. Feminism has a lot of metaphors like this, doesn't it? It's like, we don't want a bigger slice of the pie. We want the whole bakery. Maybe the bakery is baking the wrong cakes. I don't know. But that is sort of the lines I'm sort of thinking along these lines. Is the definition of woman that was being used so fundamentally wrong, so inherently wrong, that you can't additively fix it? You can't make it. You shouldn't keep using it. It's not a question of fixing by including. It's recognizing that something deeper. It's kind of trying to go deeper, isn't it? It's a little bit.
Well, it seems like you're getting into in some ways is dealing with complicity, right? In the strong sense, as opposed to saying like there's a flaw that can be corrected with a sort of like an epistemological shift, a recognition of one's subject position, right? And thus a more inclusive feminism can be born. That in fact there's got to be this is how I read you. There has to be a sort of excavation, understanding things like, oh, from the beginning of the canon of what we call feminism is in alliance with imperial projects as well as with whiteness. To me, complicity and the need to confront that. And yeah, I do want to use this language, maybe I'm thinking psychoanalytically, of excavation, which I do think that in addition to the bestiary that you're doing, you are doing that sort of, I don't know, I'm picturing, man, we're all sorts of metaphors today. I'm picturing like one of those, like, I never know the difference, but my nephew would definitely know which truck is the one that that like lets you go really deep and understand like what are the roots.
I don't think language can necessarily do it on its own, because people will find a way to insert distance, right? Like a word like complicity can, in some cases, actually mean sort of the opposite of what we're talking about, i.e. the feminism itself is not, it can't itself be the evil thing. It is complicit with the real evil thing. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I mean, but this is where we keep, if you spend a lot of time in this kind of research and thought, and as I've had, you get rather dizzy actually, because of the way that attempts to sit with it, to wrap your head around the possibility that feminism is actually not peripheral to, but perhaps central to certain forms of anti-liberatory force, systemic domination. You start realizing how hard it is to express that, partly because of the way that we have defined, historicized, narrated, and come to understand, like the grammar of our thought about feminism is so deeply part of this. So people say feminism is, in bed with or allied with, or seduced by, or being tokenized by, or being duped by, the actually bad thing. But it is never the feminism itself that is doing the dominating, the dehumanizing, and the making disposable. And in a certain sense, I suppose I'm making this gesture of like, well, what if actually it is a central player?
It seems to be, it's a no matter where I think readers will go with it, I think provided that they're willing to sit with a kind of like reflection on their own impulses, to have a kind of let's call it like a hygienized or like a idealized sort of essentialized almost, or like a temporal sense of what the term means, they're not going to be able to account for, or they're going to be missing something in terms of simply recognizing, I think, what I take to be two core things that your sort of survey does. Namely, one, and I think this is something we've already talked about a good deal, right? That there are features of the, explicit platforms and the biographies and the choices of many people who are explicitly feminist luminaries and taught as such, which are neglected precisely insofar as they involve, pivoting on axes of anti-blackness or anti-indigeneity, et cetera. And this, makes us look, the people who I don't know, I was encouraged to read scholastic books about as like, feminist icons, that they have this history of actually other things that have been sort of pruned away. But it also requires attention to the second thing, which is the remarkable existence and considerable political power of movements, historically speaking, that have self-identified as feminists, that have used that word, or that have mobilized a notion of woman or womanhood precisely to move forward projects of oppression and violence. And I think that being able to think about that, or to use the concept of feminism that we may have inchoately or reflectively to kind of see what might connect those two things, is a worthwhile endeavor in its own right, regardless of where we go with the term. And I don't think that's just like an abstract, like consciousness raising question in some ways, though I think, obviously that's valuable in its own right. But it also like clarified for me some like weird lacunae in otherwise very well trod historiography. And like how we know and understand events. And what I was specifically thinking about, and you talk about this in the book, but it also, I think, has some other resonances. I found myself thinking, for example, about how little has been written, comparatively speaking, except in the past few years, about like women in the antebellum South, white women specifically, or the kind of remarkable history. And here I'm thinking about the work of Stephanie McCurry, who has this wonderful history, Confederate Reckoning, right? And the question of why the South lost the war, or if it actually did lose the war, are things that can be debated at different levels for a million different reasons ad infinitum, right? But one thing that definitely did happen in the Confederate States of America as the war wound on was brutal food shortages that were met by a response organized and led by women paramilitaries who would seize bakeries and intercept like government sort of like financial transfers and threaten their congressmen and write them, and would do so explicitly, again, speaking as women, as a collective with this sort of experience that was actually, we might also see as being like kind of like a very legible class consciousness, right? And one thing the book contains are some letters by these women to their congressmen who they're threatening to kill, right? Yeah. And they're very, very frank about this. I'm just going to give you two. They self-identify as regulators after a venerable tradition of vigilantism. But like, they're literally like, there's some woman who like, she hijacks a government carriage, she gets up there with 2 6 guns, and she's releasing bread to the masses, et cetera, right?
Wow.
It's wild stuff, and it really actually does affect the state. And part of, not, this is neither here nor there, but one thing McCurry does in the book that's really interesting is that she argues that it actually is one of the few spaces, women's activism in the Confederacy is one of the few things that actually does change Confederate policy domestically, which is otherwise riven by all these contradictions about property and taxes and stuff, but that she detects the rudiments of what later becomes the progressive welfare state in the reforms of helping Confederate women who are on the home front get like bread and stuff, right? It's really interesting. But here's one woman, and this is all in the context here is poorer men are unable to buy their way out of service, right? And so they are fighting on the front, and oftentimes these are families that don't have slaves. Right? So I believe slavery is doomed to die out, and that God is going to liberate, and then she uses a slur, and that fighting any longer is fighting against God. Now, sir, you and some of the rest of those big bugs will have to answer for the blood of our dear ones who have been slain. God will demand their blood at your hands. These words are badly written, but they are words not to be denied by any God-fearing man. And then here's the other one that really I think hit me. Sir, and this now they're writing a senator. We have sons and brothers and husbands who is now fighting for the big man's Negro and are determined to have bread or blood out of their barns, and that at a price that we can pay, or we will slaughter as we go. And so there's a domestic insurgency of women that defeats the Confederacy and that has class consciousness, right? But also their class consciousness pivots on their resentment that their menfolk and their sort of social station doesn't allow them to trade in black people as human chattel.
Mm.
And like, this is a feminism, yes, but it's just that solidarity is not given.
I want to see if we can get into some of these case studies, Sophie, of the problematic is like a kind of too light of a word, but we'll go with it for a moment. So the case studies, these sort of problematic feminisms and enemy feminisms that you take up. So in the book, this is something I want listeners to understand. You know, Sophie weaves together this remarkable array of individual biographies and political historical moments from figures that, you know, you may or may not know, like policewoman Mary Sophia Allen and quote unquote civilizer Mae French Sheldon, to pro-life feminist Erica Bacciocchi, as well as figures who I think listeners are more likely to be familiar with, from Mary Wollstonecraft to Catherine McKinnon to Ayaan Hirsi Ali. So, Sophie, can we talk about the threads that run through these stories, the ideologies they share, the functions they serve, and any figures in particular you want to highlight who are especially germane to our present moment?
Yes. As you can imagine, I tried hard to find ways to neatly tie it all up with a bow and say, look, here is the through line, here's the mistake they all made or something. It's not quite that neat, and nor should it perhaps be. But there are obviously echoes, and I was surprised to find so many things recurring. There is, you know, it's a very ambitious historic swathe I've set myself, right? And yet you find these startling echoes between, for instance, the prohibitionist, anti-prostitution feminism of the 1910s and 1920s, and then the shape of that in the 1980s, both of which sort of followed an efflorescence of very different feminism, you know, more sex. I mean, I realize fully, by the way, that the risk I'm constantly sort of skirting is, you know, overstating or romanticizing the liberatory hegemony of what came before, the counter-revolutionary moments that I'm identifying, right? I try to be careful about that. But let's say, you know, at the end of the 19th century, you have feminists fighting for, and to an extent with, sex workers, right? Against the state, right? The state is the pimp, and the medical establishment is the pimp, and the army is the pimp. And Josephine Butler, the pioneer of the sort of Anti-Contagious Diseases Act's crusade, she called it a crusade, you know? And, you know, none of these figures are unproblematic, shall we say, right? I mean, the ones that I'm counterposing to the enemies. Although I don't do that in a sort of neat way. Initially, you can imagine the editors wanted me to be like, okay, and now for each chapter, give me a comrade, friend, feminist. And I was like, no, we're not going to do that. And I'm allowed not to do that with Haymarket, who have been wonderful, by the way. But yeah, so you have this kind of figure who is, certainly, you know, all sorts of things that we might criticize, but quite a libertarian left figure, sort of anti-state liberal, Josephine Butler, who is insistent that you cannot tell women what to do with their bodies. And she is fighting for sex workers to get out of prostitution because of their desire to get out of prostitution, but she is not, she's quite angry with feminists who come and try and, you know, criminalize and police and psychiatrically incarcerate sexually deviant girls or whatever. And so that's an interesting story, because the wave that then starts up of sort of so-called white slavery feminism is a moral panic that gets a lot of teenage girls incarcerated, basically, for being sexually active, for being mothers, for being horny, for being prostitutes, unrepentant prostitutes. And then, essentially in the late 60s and 70s, as in 1960s and 70s, you get, I think it's, very well put by Alice Eccles in her famous history, Daring to be Bad, a pessimistic counter-revolution within feminism that tips over into hegemonic status circa 1973, and which begins to do female cultural nationalism, where previously there had been, what Eccles insists on calling radical feminism, the sort of more utopian movements that were interested in children's liberation, in erotic liberation, in the communization of care, and so on and so forth. And then you get the sort of rise of figures like Robin Morgan, Kathleen Barry, and yes, Andrea Dworkin, and later, come lately, figure Catherine McKinnon, who are then purposively and with their eyes open, making alliances with the anti-feminist far right in order to push through anti-pornography legislation, right? Okay, and then, I'm sure that chapter is going to be the most controversial among certain portions of the contemporary feminist online universe, because Dworkin is an interesting. I actually just read Scapegoat, her book about Israel, which I actually had not properly read before, and so as I have tried recently to articulate my concerns about Dworkin's politics, that the orientation, the way what it points has gravely concerned me, but I've attempted to do that in a comradely way, quote unquote, on its own terms, i.e. the terms of the prevalence conversation, which sets aside her Zionism. But I now actually want to write something else, because I've gone through Scapegoat, the Jews, Israel, and women's liberation with a fine comb, and I think there is a lot to say, which links directly to what Patrick has been pulling from the archive, actually, for what it's worth. But I'm sure we can talk for 5 hours.
Yeah.
But the through lines, Abby, sorry. I'm worse than Patrick.
Sorry.
The through lines include a sort of, I'm going to say a sort of nationalism. And what do I mean by that? There's a great essay by Alexander Stoffel, who is the author of Eros and Empire. He argues that trans-exclusionary so-called radical feminists, or as they like to call themselves, gender-critical feminists, are sexual nationalists. And so I got to thinking about this, and I'm sort of borrowing his analysis quite a bit. But there's, when you think about how it's not controversial to say that nativism among British voters, who were wooed by the slogan "Take Back Control," were committed, xenophobes when they committed the United Kingdom to quitting the European Union. We don't draw connections between those sorts of nativist passions and this kind of vituperative cissexism in Britain's establishment feminism. But actually, the same tropes of strong borders exist centrally in both, right? And so that's a thing I would say is threaded through the sense that womanhood is a territory to be defended, and you get that trope, I think, in pretty much all of them. Should I read out my list of archetypes briefly for listeners? I mean,
I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's see. I've got chapter 1, the quote unquote enslaved English woman goes abroad. Warming up here, with the so what is it? The woman is the N-word of the world. Opening thought of Western feminism. I've got the anti-racist abolitionist, the civilizer, the prohibitionist, the KKK feminist. Now that's a term people will, startle at. Linda Gordon advances it and defends it as well. Actual KKK feminism. The black shirt, the policewoman, the pornophobe. That's a term from Carol Lee, actually. Porno here meaning whore, depiction of the lives of whores. The girl boss, easy. The femo-nationalist, the pro-life feminist, yes. As the philosopher Victoria Brown laments in Radical Philosophy, how is that even a thing? It is. The adult human female, which is the so-called TERF. So those are 11 ways of being an enemy feminist. And as I think you rightly suggested to me in an email, Abby, there are probably gradations, right? Gradations of enmity. But we have threads of femphobia here, an essay collection you mentioned that will be forthcoming next year. I've written is femphilia. I think the disgust at self-consciously artificial femininity, i.e. femphobia. Fem and feminine is not they're not synonyms here. The fem is the self-consciously constructed, the self-consciously artificial, or this is, I guess, borrowing from the Cyborg Manifesto of Donna Haraway's as well. But so we have femphobia. Of course, whiteness are, I'm not going to deny at all. I'm building on the whiteness analysis. This is a through line throughout all of it. But what do you think? What do you see as the echoes and through lines?
I was trying to think about it, right? And I found myself in difficult territory of like trying to be both diagnostic and also moralizing at the same time, right? Or like a little bit of both. And the words that started proliferating were like refusals to think different, right? Or like that there's like a bandwidth capacity for exactly how much difference like a given person's worldview can apparently accommodate, at least under certain circumstances, and especially if they like want to assert their own kind of primacy or participation in some group. I also found myself returning to that like classic of all things, and of course a lot of these enemy feminists cite him too, but that MLK line about like Jim Crow is this kind of fantasy meal that you can eat, or that the white Southerner gets to eat, particularly when they're poor, that allows them to think that there's some sort of narcissism or of small differences, like a margin of difference between them and someone else. And that seemed to speak to like this combination of like both psychic dividends and structural kind of complicity at the same time. And yet I also found myself thinking that these choices are very different for different people in different times at the same time too, right? Some of the people who are the fellow travelers and the, as Linda Gordon talks about in her work on the Klan, or I guess what I'm trying to articulate is I found myself realizing that I was falling into certain types of traps, or at least a tendency to think about like the sincerity of the beliefs, right?
That's
And that was one, or that like, or that I might have been even projecting at times the possibility of cognitive dissonance onto people for whom there isn't that.
Oh, see, I didn't see that at all. That's very interesting. I never questioned and maybe this is, this is a disciplinary kind of thing where I've spent a lot of time reading feminist writing by people with whom I disagree, one way or another. Although I usually find a way to inhabit some portion of it. But for me, I actually, in addition to like kind of an utter sincerity, I read this as involving a certain like affective character of righteousness. But more importantly, I think what ties a lot of this together is the idea, the deeply counterintuitive idea that liberation arises through constraint and control. But so thinking about, let's crack down, for instance, on the consumption of, I feel like this is a very micro example, like on the consumption of alcohol.
Yeah.
Right. Or, and now let's make the stakes significantly higher. Let's criminalize prostitution. Right. This is how we make women free. Now we make the stakes the stakes are already high in that case. But when you get to the logic of feminist policing, carceral logic fundamentally, right? Then again, you get this idea that the freedom of women is increased not only through the more extensive exercise of the law, but also through women themselves being the ones to do the exercising, right? So in some ways I see it's not that there is like a line throughout the book where things get like rougher and rougher and rougher, but I do think there are gradations, right? And maybe I will let that thought take me into my next question for you, Sophie, which is about the language of the title, right? We've been dealing more with one of these terms with feminism, but it's clearly a very deliberate choice, right? It's not an innocuous word, enemy.
No.
And it raises, or at least for me, it raises this question, what do you do once you have identified your enemies or your enemy feminisms, right? If I think about it like as an academic, primarily, I think, oh, okay, well, this is a clarifying exercise. It helps to shore up the contours of your own version of feminism, which is clearly, centered on, among many other things, a commitment to communal care and also to pleasure. Right, those are two of the pole stars that clearly anchor that vision, right? But also, does it do something else? And this is where I get into the question of there are different gradations, and I'm thinking about it maybe sort of quotidianly in terms of like, what would I tell people to read? Because I am in that sort of position of like, I do teach an introduction to gender studies. That I usher people into feminism as part of my actual job, is figuring out what are those texts. And I mean, these are not all texts that I assign in like 101, but I'm not going to stop teaching Mary Wollstonecraft, right? I don't think I don't think I ought to. And I also am going to continue, because I teach a class on consent, coercion and consent. So of course I'm going to continue teaching Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, because they're important thinkers of consent. And these are all among the enemies that you single out in the first part of the book. But also, I'm never going to tell my students, like, go read these TERFs or these pro-life feminists. But also I'm thinking, Sophie, when I took your class once, there is a text that, and I also teach an intro to transgender studies. There is a text that I think in any intro to that subject, you have to dance around, which is Janice Raymond, The Transsexual Empire, which is a thoroughly hateful book. And I remember you being like, here it is. You don't have to read it, but also you have to know something about it, right? So there are these ways in which we have to have these sorts of encounters. And then, just to keep going with the gradations, there are, I'm limiting this to folks who appear in your book here. There are these like legendary feminist figures like Adrienne Rich. And, you recount how, this moment of transphobia that goes unrepented to her grave. Or folks like, Sylvia Federici, who I know is really important for you and is important for me, as this vital thinker of Marxist feminism, but who has taken an anti-trans turn recently. So like, what do we do with all this within the framework of enemy feminisms?
Fantastic question. Thank you for setting that up. Immediately I'm sort of thinking about this other moment of feminist history that Adrienne Rich is involved with, that I've just been writing about separately, where she was part of a Jewish feminist collective that called anti-Zionism racism and anti-Semitism in 1982. Bad time, to be defending Zionism given the invasion of Lebanon and so on, right? But this fight between Black feminist poets like June Jordan and other lesbian feminists over the question of Zionism is a fascinating archive that I'm currently up to my ears in, and Adrienne Rich recanted on that point, right? I hope, let me just trumpet it, right, in case it's misunderstood. I really hope, and I'm pretty confident that my book cannot be misunderstood as a sort of purgative, purificatory taxonomy. I mean, that would just be repeating the problem, wouldn't it?
Right. It's not like Mary Wollstonecraft canceled.
In. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I this is not to contradict you. Well, maybe it's a debate.
It's okay.
Authors don't always know what their books say. This is the gift I find of talking about my books in the past. I've have had it explained to me what I was trying to do and what I said, and that's part of the wonder of it. But I think I explicitly do not taxonomize Wollstonecraft's thought as maybe like on balance anti-liberatory. I'm sort of getting into gear, right? I'm getting into gear talking about Wollstonecraft because she's the opening words of Western Anglophone feminism.
Right.
So yeah, exactly. I say it's not straightforwardly a comrade feminism, right? Which is rather a banal point given her imperialism, her Orientalism, and you know what? Her misogyny, which is a controversial way of describing it, but Susan Gubar
it's really
has a
clear,
wonderful essay.
actually.
Yeah.
I think that's really clear.
Yeah, and her repressive bourgeois maternalism. But, you know, I'm rather keen on her, really keen.
I actually love Mary Wollstonecraft, despite all of those things. I think about this line that she has whenever I get very upset about like needing to like present myself in a certain way before I like leave the house, where she says the thoughts of women hover ever around their bodies. And I'm like, and of course she means it in this way where it's like, well, we should fucking stop doing that and all be like men and like be, you know, fit and not like, you know, these decadent upper class women or soldiers. I love that soldiers come in for a beating from Mary Wollstonecraft too. But like there's moments of just like where she also talks about not making like virtue doesn't have a sex. Like I don't want to leave that behind. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, she, you know, I give her lots of credit, I think, for all the things she said that were completely world changing. And I have affection for her wrestling with herself, her own sexual desire, for example. She seems to want to wrestle down into submission.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, we could go on and on, I'm sure. But, for, you know, so as for this, you know, this question you've put, so let's say, for Sylvia, for Federici, you know, I think it's not a question at all of a taxonomy here. My God, you know, it's not like, boom, you're in that category per se because you wrote one thing. What I'm saying is, if you stand on that barricade, right, then the feminism that you are doing, Sylvia, or whatever, is an enemy feminism, and I will fight what you are doing as your enemy. I suppose at some point the distinction between her and her actions becomes moot. If she stands there, I will stand on the other side of the barricade.
But it's interesting because you may be in fact using earlier Sylvia Federici to inform what is.
That's right.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you know, it's interesting. You're making me understand that one of the things I've been doing for 10 years now is pissing people against themselves. So I wrote a sort of Haraway against Haraway essay that was surprisingly influential and was one of the most meaningful things for me at that time, because I could never have dreamed that the person who introduced me, who sort of made me a feminist in the way I feel I am one, Donna Haraway with her Cyborg Manifesto, really lit something inside me that is central to my my being. And then I wrote a sort of love letter to that text that was also a very angry sort of perhaps denunciation of the more recent population analysis.
Right.
That essay was such a big process, such an emotional moment for me. And to my amazement, the woman herself reached out, and I got to have breakfast with her because of it. And she was quite upset. Why would you be upset about a nobody age 25 or something writing a review on an obscure blog? You know, that's the thing about her. She's amazing. You know, she really walks the walk. She's extremely egalitarian in her sensibilities. And so for her, it really was a question of, you know, sister, you've called me racist. What the fuck? I'm actually really upset.
Yeah.
And that was just it was so transformative for me to have that as a pedagogical moment. And I really thought, my God, that's the level of non-defensiveness. I mean, of course there was defensiveness. She was also saying, what the fuck? But she was also saying, I'm upset because you got at something, you know?
Right.
And that's that I really aspire to that. And she also, you know, hit me back a little bit.
Mhm.
She said some stuff about stuff I've written as well, and I thought about it to the best of my ability, non-defensively too. But the point is here, maybe we can be, and this is complicated, but maybe we are fated to be enemies of one another, sort of in praxis, in time, in space, case by case almost. I mean, what do I say? If you'll indulge me, I guess I'll read the little section.
Sure.
A commitment to impurity in politics, a commitment I think of as key to anti-fascism, has to walk hand in hand with the courage to draw lines and fight people if necessary, even kin. So in other words, feminists who, like me, are committed anti-fascists, or anti-fascists who are also feminists, as they must be, if proper anti-fascists, need to know the difference between forgiving enemies and giving up the fight against them. This has to be crystal clear. I suppose it's a question of learning to more confidently oppose people whom we understand, or whom we also love, perhaps, or whose other work we use and are indebted to. So a cop is still my enemy when she's my neighbor, and perhaps, we have all kinds of shared history. That's really hard. But this is sort of more important than ever in this moment where Democrats use the word fascist about Donald Trump and then handed over power, peacefully. We can feel compassion for QAnon moms and still liquidate their armory. We can forgive, or whatever, a pro-life feminist and still destroy the forced birth judiciary. In a sense, that's the sort of not personal part of it, or something. I guess that's aspirational. Politics is messy. But what I would say is that the enmity was there before I named it, right? It's been there. That's kind of my point. I personally, and people will disagree with me, and I hope they do, and perhaps I will end up being wrong about this, but I don't think it has helped us to be shy, to pull our punches about the naming of enmity, or to sort of try and do a workaround where we're like, well, if they are our enemies, they're not really feminists. The thing is, it confuses us, it disorganizes us, I think. The good news about the dive into history that shows, as I think I do, that these actual fascists in many cases were, quote unquote, real, yes, real feminists, is that people thought they were assholes at the time, right? In their movements, right? Did I say good news? Yes, that's the good news. You can go into the archive and look at what the horrible transphobic feminists were up to in the early 70s and then 80s, at which point they were unfortunately hegemonic along with the pornophobia. But the thing that is empowering and comforting is that the conference is wildly against them in 1973, right? The West Coast Lesbian Conference is shouting these assholes down and saying, what are you talking about? The transsexual woman that you are trying to expel from the land organized the fucking conference that you're at. How dare you? She is our sister, right? Which is not the sort of version of history that I think a lot of people receive. There's this notion, which I am actually very pedantically annoying about in my everyday life. When people say second wave to mean racist, transphobic, etc., I say, no, that's not what you mean. You don't mean second wave. You mean cultural feminist. You mean the counter-revolution. Because I think we are stripping ourselves of ancestors all the time. We're denying ourselves a much, much more complex, rich sort of efflorescence of care communalizational, broadly speaking, trans-welcoming, pro-trans, trans-inclusive, family abolitionist, sex radical activity. And why is it that we do that? Why is it that we let the gender criticals, the TERFs, etc., tell us that they were the only game in town and that they are what radical feminism is and always was? And why do we melancholically believe them? This purposive erasure of a certain truth, a counter truth, which is that yes, they they won and they got to write the history, but by no means were they uncontested. I mean, I'm here saying, and it's pretty strange, isn't it? Sometimes a feminist is a feminist, even though she dedicates her time to the dispossession and ostracism of a group of women. And I'm saying that female anti-feminism and right-wing feminism are distinct phenomena. Like both of them exist, right? And so when I'm picking my history, I'm not looking at female anti-feminism, very interesting topic in its own right, but I'm not looking at that.
No.
I mean, that category is relatively well established. I mean, we can just point to available data that, there's a suggestion that 46% of women voters in the 2024 election voted for Trump, right? Up from 39%, right? And so on. And then, I think the question I'm asking is what, when anti-trans, nativist, anti-abortion, you name it, figures of the Euro-American right self-designate as feminists, are we advancing our cause by saying that's insincere, that's invalid, that's sort of prima facie impossible? Because meanwhile, the Heritage Foundation and its Women's Liberation Front group has been getting on with its business for several years, right? 7 or 8. I mean, back in 2019, February, the New York Times was just about cottoning on. And like, what's the deal with TERF Island? It wanted to know, right? Because at that point, things were just really spreading. I mean, every writer wants to say that their book is more relevant now than ever. But I mean, I will say that the fact of J.K. Rowling tweeting approvingly of the executive order from Trump, quote unquote, defending women against gender ideology extremism, is sort of something I couldn't have,
If you were an MFA workshop and this were fiction, I would say it was too on the nose.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, Sophie, one of the things I want to say about the enemy frame and also about, you're not focusing on women anti-feminists, right? Is another way of thinking, at least to my mind, that might be, what do I want to say? I feel my brain going off in like 4 directions at once. So let's try to go in 2 directions at once. One, I noticed as a reader and as somebody who is, I'm very fond of a lot of these figures. I'm not fond of the KKK feminists and the explicit fascists, right? But I'm fond of some of these writers because I teach them and because I think, I'm interested in seeing them as flawed people who cannot live out of their own time and yet had certain insights that I think are important to memorialize and to understand those legacies, even if, as this book makes enormously clear, those legacies are deeply fraught, right? So I noticed myself, and one thing I had to kind of let go of was, I was like, stop getting defensive, Abby.
Yeah.
Like on behalf of some of these people. You know what I mean? And the way that I felt that I was able to do that was, I in no way want to undermine the sort of like, there is you are taking a scalpel here. You are drawing lines, right? You are really drawing lines and in the sand and talking about like opposition, like the enemy language. Again, it's not an accident. But I also saw this book as a sense of who could be my comrade, right? And that's like the moment where we can maybe be like, we don't have to blow the tent away or burn the tent or whatever. We can return to this big tent kind of thing. But maybe that's the question, right? Is in understanding something fundamental about the enemy, one can also understand something fundamental about camaraderie. I don't know if that resonates for you, but for me, that seems like part of the sort of positive political project of the book.
Yes, I love this. Thank you for elucidating all of that. I had forgotten to answer part of your earlier musing about what you would and would not assign in the context of your pedagogical logic and institutional context, right? Is that for the Brooklyn Institute, perhaps you know this, but I also teach a course, I've taught it twice, on the etiology of TERFism.
Yeah, I do. I do know that.
assign them. So it's true. In that course that I did with you on trans feminism, I included some Raymond, but I waved my hands and said, "Don't read this if you don't want to," because it's a course on trans feminism.
Yeah.
But and who knows? Maybe we differ, or it's just a different context. But I assign all of the enemies. If people want to study it, which I think some people should want to, I think diversity of tactics. I am not going to ask all of my trans siblings to do a 12-hour deep dive into Mary Daly, Janice Raymond, and the rest of them.
Yeah.
However, it is, I think, anti-fascist practice for some of us to do so. So I do assign all of them, right, in a course specifically on that.
Right.
And it's a difficult thing. I don't know why I always set myself such difficult tasks. That space is very difficult to hold, because you want to be able to tease out seductions in the text, things that resonate at the same time as being uncompromising about the enmity in play. Enmity is a hard word. Do we want to briefly touch on the lost title? I was going to call this book Feminism of Fools, The Feminism of Fools, by analogy to the term that I've since realized nobody knows. Or, well, obviously nerds know this phrase, but I mean, you know what it means. But it turns out a lot of people on the street don't know what you mean when you say the socialism of fools, this 19th century term that was coined to talk about a new anti-Semitism, slightly distinct from the, traditional right-wing Christian anti-Semitism. This kind of new anti-Semitism that was pretending to be an anti-capitalism and was talking about finance as the only problem with capitalism, and was very opposed to class struggle and was hoping to unite boss and worker in a national organic whole. And so, the figure of the Jew was the problem. And, what they were getting at was that there's a kernel of something, there's some kind of impulse to be like, oh, capitalism's wrong. And, it is pretty difficult to, I was just reminded of how many workers were actually sitting around reading Das Kapital, when it came out. Kudos, it's extremely hard to do that, I think. I think so. Struggled with it, and so, getting your head around relations of accumulation and the totality it is difficult. Fuck, none of us comes out of the womb understanding the totality. And so people can slip and fall into fascism. It's no joke, right? The socialism of fools isn't just like, oh, foolish, like, whoops, small error. No, it's like national socialism, we fight those people. We don't debate them. We hit them, we confront them, we drive them off the streets. I don't know if liberals know this. It seems they really don't. It seems they absolutely don't. No, I know they don't. But that is what we do with fascists, right? This is a lesson of history. So the feminism of fools, I was trying to make an analogy. You may have a complete certainty, and certainty is a big one, the through line, the thing you were talking about a sort of what was it? What was the phrase you used? An unwillingness to think difference or something.
Yeah.
The feminisms of fools are ontologically oriented.
Yeah.
Maybe this is also
Yes.
what I'm getting at when I say the feminism of cisness, because that's another way I talk about the things they all have in common. That it's an ontological orientation. We know what women are, and because we know that with certainty, all the other boundaries we're building on top of that primordial definition can and must also be defended, often with state or paramilitary force or something. It is intense language, On the left, we don't like to talk about things like, I don't know, hate, for instance, right? I briefly found myself defending hate circa, when was that? I can't remember. But Tucker Carlson invited me on his show, and I said no, unless he donated $30,000 to the Yellowhammer Abortion Fund. And he aired a few seconds of my Verso promotional video
I remember
talking
that.
about
Yeah.
abortion. And in response to that, there was an absolute deluge of people wishing all kinds of violence on me, very graphically. And I was sort of taxonomizing out of interest all the different things that people were saying to me, praying for me, hoping that I would get, X and Y and Z, you can imagine. But I was sort of quite sure that I didn't want to respond by writing off every voice as not really a person, not really someone who meant it. And it got me thinking about hatred and how I've never been convinced by the idea that hatred is uniformly sort of to be rejected. I think I've been moved by moments in Marxist theory. I'm trying to think who it was. I want to say it was Tronti, who has a thing about the higher form of hatred that we come to by deeply meditating on capital's totality. In order to really love ourselves and our people and life, perhaps a hatred of what capitalism does and is and makes people is necessary and even generative or fruitful.
That's actually an incredible mirroring of the series that we've just been doing on Winnicott and hate and aggression, and the idea that the child needs to have their own hate because it's the precondition and, in fact, chronologically prior to love.
Yeah.
Uncanny
Yeah.
mirror.
That is uncanny. Yeah. Some of the trans exclusionary radicals or extremists, perhaps, I find it difficult to feel much towards them except hatred. I think Robin Morgan is the big one for me. I just find her certainty and her bloodthirstiness just terrifying. And I find myself left cold. Maybe, who knows? I haven't read enough of her to get any complication of that happening within me. But Jan Raymond, my God, that is an interesting ride. No, sorry, that's not it. Yes. Well, Mary Daly and Jan Raymond both. And the fact that they clearly are erotically so hot for each other. I mean, Jan Raymond was her PhD supervisee.
They're so wild to read too, both of them.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Mary Daly never met a noun she didn't want to capitalize.
Oh, Lord. It's just, psychedelic in a bad way. But there's something about the sort of level of intelligence and curiosity that Jan Raymond does possess that leads her to paint herself into corners all the time. And it's like, why are you doing this, babe? You're just, she's smart enough to recognize certain affinities of experience between trans women and herself. Because yes, guess what? Butch, cis lesbians like Raymond and like many others in the ecology of TERFism today are kicked out of public bathrooms and questioned because they're mistaken for men all the time, right? There are consonances of experience. There's the very odd, sort of plaintive, tragicomic third conditional grammar of TERF discourse in our culture, where people like Rowley and many, many others say they would have transed me if I were to be 12 years old today. They would trans me. Which what they're saying is,
which betrays so much more than they think it does.
There was a boy, a man. there was a trans person there who they shut the door on very firmly, and good that they did. Good that they are today the J.K. Rowling you see before you. Thank God. Just imagine how bad it would have been to have indulged that prior person's desire, right? And it's no good psychoanalyzing these people, but of course J.K. Rowling's, writing persona is Robert Galbraith. But the thing is, you can put all this on the table, you can look at Jan Raymond constantly making arguments that appear to prove the opposite of what she's then about to say.
Yeah.
Again and again and again. And you're like, oh.
It's the whole structure of the book. Yeah.
But again, are we going to do anti-fascism? Are we going to protect the people who very materially are dispossessed and driven out of public life and in a slow eugenic sense sort of genocided by these discourses? Or are we going to kind of sit around, confused?
I think this is a nice moment for us to talk explicitly about the positive political vision that is at work, not only in Enemy Feminisms, but in all of your previous writing. So you end the book, this is the final chapter, with a plea for what you call feminism against cisness. And it's in this chapter, and I want to make sure that I read this brief quotation from you, because I thought this was such a just beautifully concise and interesting statement of a term that's important to psychoanalysis, especially feminist psychoanalysis, or anyone who cares about Lacan or whatever. Lots of people who will be listening to this, which is to say sexual difference. And so you write that, quote, sex is mostly not pre-discursive. All bodies are penetrable, but sexual difference, as we all tend to think about it, is a social hierarchy based on denying this universal penetrability, close quote. So I was hoping that we could talk about the implications of that universal penetrability, along with what you mean by arguing for a feminism against cisness.
Before I say anything else, I have to credit my friend and comrade Emma Heaney for that formulation, Feminism Against Cisness. It's
you turned me on to her work. I should thank you for that.
Yeah. It's also the title of her edited collection, right? Feminism Against Cisness. What she's doing there, and she calls it a question of two distinct sort of knotted materialisms, two materialisms that are sort of knotted together. And she's sort of complementing a more familiar Marxist feminist materialism that has to do with reproductive labor with this new layer, if you like, that is about penetrability, and which gives us the possibility of having sexual difference without cisness. And so this kind of comes on the basis of her longstanding scholarship on provincializing cisness, basically, showing concretely, historically, that it is cisness that is the parvenu category, if you like, that cisness is not what has moved revolutionary feminism. It is, in fact, the thing that has come in to capture it and neutralize it. So, the vocabulary of reproductive labor is great. I think it's very clarifying as a way of looking at how woman or women gets produced. Like, what is that? It's a question of labor, a division of labor. But there's also something that it doesn't quite reach. So this is a common complaint or observation, by the way, right? As I'm sure you know, like people are like, there's a little excess that it doesn't catch, something about violence, something about, there's some other thing. And so this framework about penetrability denied is, it helps people who are just incredulous that all a woman is like, I don't know. It comes from the question of who does the washing up or something. Like, really? And so this second component is necessary. It's about intimate relationships. It's about forms of social relation and social value that are organized around a register of social experience that does arise from the reproductive-productive labor split, but is not totally described by them. And so there's a way in which we can have an account of sexual difference that holds both in the negative, so in terms of accounts of sexual violence, interpersonal social organization of aggression and hatred and loathing and minimizing and condescension and so on, and then also in the positive in terms of the solidarities and mutualities and pleasures produced by the organization of labor into these two categories, right? This is all really based on my kinship with Emma, I want to say. So what this gives us is a sense of sexual difference as something you cannot impose on people from the outside, and yet which, it is still a concept that works, that shows us both a negative ascription and a positive pull. And this is how the world works. It's difficult. There's some sociological material that shows that trans-exclusionary minds, transphobic minds, are, as you kind of would expect, I suppose, like above average intolerant of ambivalence and ambiguity, right? If sexual difference is something that can actually exist materially in the world and yet sort of change within one body, like shift, be something that is both sort of embodied and material and real and not permanent or constant or ontological, what happens to all of our sort of certainties about who is in the bathroom or whatever? And at the same time, who cares, right? Like as Grace Lavery sort of says very eloquently in a review of certain recent transphobic feminist books, feminism has never been about the question of what a woman is. It really doesn't matter. It has not mattered to feminism. It just has not. And we just get on with it. There are these false problems that we get obsessed with somehow, like, hospitals are not allowing birthing people to be called mothers or women. First of all, I don't think there's any evidence that that's actually happening. Secondly, who cares if people are called birthing people? Like hospitals have just been getting on with it. That hospitals have been getting on with it for a long time, calling people what they want to be called. The problems are false, right? The problem of, trans women in sports is false. It's completely false. And of course, there are many horrifying bad jokes that history is playing on us right now with, so much of the trans exclusionary feminist effort of recent years being opposed to what they have framed as a sort of liberal, hegemonic proscription of the word women.
Yeah.
Which is in fact what the Trump administration has now imposed. Woman is one of the words, or women is one of the words that's now not allowed in terms of federal funding applications, right? I mean, it's not funny. I'm not happy about this, obviously, my goodness. But I think it does mean that we have not got the luxury anymore of being sort of condescending in that way that, in a sense, the instrumentalized by, duped by, in bed with frameworks tend to be, right? Like at this point, is J.K. Rowling just kind of mistaken? Whoops, or is it a powerful enough embodiment, crystallization of something that is concretely, killing people? That in a sense, I don't care at the end of the day whether you call her a real feminist or not. I think it is a form of feminism. What I care about is that you don't hesitate because you think she's a feminist in opposing her full-throatedly.
Sophie, thank you so much for being with us today. My understanding, because your book comes out tomorrow, congratulations ahead of time, and that you are going on quite a book tour, and because this episode will be out quite soon, I wonder if you might tell our listeners where and when they can catch you.
Thanks. This is actually one of the first extended conversations I've had about this book, so I'm sure I will benefit so much from the teasing out of the arguments that you've lavished on me. So tomorrow the book comes out. By the time listeners hear this, I will be about to do a panel on fascism at the Psychoanalysis and Politics conference. It's called The Impossible Relation. It's held by the Green Clinic. That's on the 23rd of February. On the 25th, which I think is a Tuesday, I will be at Books Are Magic with Grace Byron at 7 p.m. After that, I'll be in Baltimore, in Washington, D.C., at Red Emma's and Solid State, respectively. I go to Europe. I come back. I will be at the Duke Feminist Theory Workshop at Duke University towards the end of the month, as well as other places. The list is extremely long, and rather than go on, I will point listeners to my events page on my personal website, and that is lasophielle.org, L-A, and then the word Sophie, and then L-E at the end. La Sophielle.
I will put it in the show notes.
Fantastic.
I will put it in the show notes. Absolutely. Well, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much. And congratulations.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I feel very lucky to have had this conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. Ordinary Unhappiness is completely supported and kept ad-free for everyone by the generous support of our Patreon community. So if you would like to support the ongoing existence and ad-freeness of the show and get 2 additional paywalled episodes per month, please head on over and find us at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Sophie Lewis. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.